Officials say the Biden administration is looking to share millions of doses of its AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine. As many as 60 million doses are expected to be available for export over the next several months. The White House has faced increased pressure in recent weeks to share more of its supply with countries devastated by new surges of the coronavirus. The move comes as President Biden marks his 100th day in office. This week, Mr. Biden centered much of his campaign around a better response to the pandemic, and now the U.S. has become a global leader in vaccine distribution. Let's bring in Ian Bremmer to talk more about this and about where the president stands on key foreign policy promises. He is the president of the Eurasia Group and of GZero Media. It's good to see you, my friend. So let's talk about President Biden and his efforts to put human rights at the center of his foreign policy. How has that promise held up as he nears his first 100 days in office?
Well, as you just mentioned, the United States is in a position to be not just but the global leader in vaccines. Chinese vaccines are proving to be somewhat less effective. The data is open to question. Russian vaccines have had big manufacturing problems and haven't been as effective. The Indians aren't going to be able to export going forward, given the extraordinary scale of their present outbreak, which means the United States can do an enormous amount in terms of soft power by providing the humanitarian support, vaccines directly, but also allowing for export of ingredients into vaccines, providing doctors, healthcare, you name it, world's most powerful economy. But we have been slow. The response to India that came over the last 48 hours was after responses from Russia, from China. And the Indian government is not at all happy about it. It's definitely damaging our relationship with the country. So I think there's been extraordinary caution on the part of the Biden administration. You can certainly understand, Vladimir, why it is that the American government would want to make sure that Americans are vaccinated before they start exporting. But you can have a plan. You can, provide leadership, especially because the AstraZeneca jabs, we're not even approving yet for our own population. And really, we didn't need them, right? We knew that we had more than enough for Americans. So I would say here that having the scientists and the doctors leading the policy who, are very clear on what they don't know, and therefore you have a lot of risk aversion, well, what's the worst possible scenario, has undermined some of the ability of the U.S. to be effective in foreign policy.
President Biden also pledged to mend relationships with past allies while also reversing President Trump's embrace of leaders like Russian President Vladimir Putin and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. He called Vladimir Putin a killer, but then he also suggested perhaps a summit later on in the summertime. He's been critical of missile tests in North Korea, but I don't know if we've yet heard much about what the strategy will be with North Korea coming from this administration. How successful has he been at rebuilding those bonds and perhaps reframing the relationships with some of the other actors, bad actors, if you will, on the world stage?
He's been more successful with key allies among the liberal democracies. You've certainly seen that with the relationship with Japanese Prime Minister Suga, with South Korean President Moon. You've seen it with the Europeans. You've seen it with the Canadians. That has been reasonably positive. Less so with Middle Eastern allies because Biden just doesn't want to focus as much on the Middle East. But when it comes to the adversaries, these relationships are poor. With Putin, we've added sanctions. It's the worst relationship we've had with Russia probably since the early 80s when Andropov was in charge of the then Soviet Union. And it's true that Biden asked for a summit in a third country with Putin, but it was happening while the Russians were actually escalating the number of troops they had on the Ukrainian border. If anything, it showed kind of weakness, but not a policy that was going to lead to success. I think the same thing is true even with Turkey, a NATO ally, but one that we don't see eye to eye with on a lot of issues. Probably the worst relations we've had with them since the early 70s. U.S.-China, also a really challenging relationship. But Biden became president at a time when a lot of countries thought that the U.S. was in decline. And are acting in that regard. Now, I don't agree with that. Biden administration doesn't agree with that. You guys don't agree with that. But certainly the U.S. has not shown itself to be a global leader in the way it had, say, when the Soviet Union collapsed over past years. That's a significant hole for the Americans to dig themselves out of.
Well, I mean, Ian, you know better than us that sentiment is one that is expressed by a lot of foreign leaders, and we're not talking about. We're talking about countries that are part of the G7, the G8, and you mentioned also China. Former President Trump often touted his tough on China policy throughout his time in office, but the Biden administration hasn't been soft on China either. Where does the administration, and what's the record thus far?
So when Biden spoke with Xi Jinping privately on the phone, the message that was delivered was that you, China, are a principal adversary of the United States. The relationship is going to be competitive, primarily, not cooperative. But there's a question of whether it's going to be an open and healthy competition or whether it's going to be an unhealthy competition. And from Biden's perspective and the Biden administration's perspective, it's up to China to make that decision on how they behave in terms of the rules of the road supported by the United States on things like treatment of the Uyghurs or Hong Kong or Taiwan or the South China Sea. From China's perspective, the United States doesn't treat the Chinese as an equal. They should. The United States has lost all moral justification to be able to tell other countries around the world how to run themselves, not least because of the events back in the U.S. of January 6th. And the Chinese are leaning into that and saying that they want to be leaders. So even on an issue like climate, where the United States is trying to do something pretty constructive globally, the Chinese response is, no, we want to be the leaders on climate, not the United States. So even there's a competitive relationship between the United States and China. I think you saw that play out in the meeting that we had, the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, with their counterparts from China in Anchorage a month ago. I don't think it's going to get any easier, frankly. This is a country that will soon be the largest economy in the world, and they're not particularly aligned with the United States on much of anything these days.
Wow. I want to ask you about something that got some headlines, but not a lot of talk. Mr. Biden became the first U.S. president to officially recognize the massacre of Armenians under the Ottoman Empire as a genocide. Why is this significant, and why is this the first time that we've seen an American president do this?
Yeah, it is significant. This happened back in 1915. Obama, when he was running for president, committed that he was going to make that recognition, then decided against. And some of his top advisors said it was one of the biggest mistakes of the administration because Turkey's an ally. And as a NATO ally, they didn't want to undermine the relationship. They didn't want the backlash. I think that Biden, first of all, is much more committed to common values with American allies. Anthony Blinken is much more committed to issues of human rights. You've seen this in response to Saudi Arabia, for example, a number of other issues around the world, Myanmar. And by the way, Vice President Kamala Harris, when she was senator in California, was one of the co-sponsors of the legislation to recognize the Armenian genocide in the Senate. So I think all of the pieces were aligned. The other piece, of course, is that Turkey just doesn't matter as much to the United States as a NATO ally these days. And Erdogan himself has not proven himself to be a particularly democratic leader. So they made the announcement. The Armenians, of course, are jubilant about this. But the response from the Turkish government was pretty perfunctory. Erdogan said that he might consider recognizing the U.S. atrocities against Native Americans as a genocide. I would suggest that he should go ahead and do that, but he might want to recognize his own history, too.
Let me ask you about something else, Ian. On Monday, as you know, former Secretary of State and now special presidential envoy for climate change, John Kerry denied having covert discussions on Israeli airstrikes in Syria with Iran's foreign minister. This comes after leaked audio revealed over the weekend by the New York Times found that the country's foreign minister said the two spoke constantly in 2015 during negotiations on the Iran nuclear deal. So How damaging could these allegations be if they are proven true? And do you think that it's interesting, I pointed out specifically that the New York Times broke the story. I know that you're active on social media, and I've seen some suggesting that the media isn't making as much of a big deal of this as the media did over the reports of President Trump and his relationship with Vladimir Putin during the campaign and even after he became president of the United States. How do you see that media landscape specifically with these allegations?
Well, yeah, look, if Kerry were president, it would be a bigger deal. So you're right about that, not as much as being made of it. Also, let's keep in mind that some of the statements that are being talked about, like the fact that Kerry described that there were 200 Israeli strikes against Iranian interests in Syria, those had already been mentioned publicly by the Israeli defense establishment. So, look, I think what's going on, it's very clear that Kerry and Javad Zarif, who is the foreign minister of Iran and was when the Iranian nuclear deal came into place under the Obama administration. At that point, Kerry was the one driving it as Secretary of State. It's very clear that there are a lot of people in the United States, as well as in Israel, that oppose the American return to the JCPOA, the Iranian nuclear deal. The Israelis engaged in those strikes against the Iranian nuclear facility at Natanz, an effort to try to derail the deal. There is a lot of disinformation that is being circulated. There's a lot of leaks that's being circulated. I would argue that it's not going to change anything. The Americans unilaterally walked away from the Iranian nuclear deal. Biden was vice president at the time the deal was put together. The folks that are now trying to get the deal back together from the U.S. and Iran are almost the same exact people from both the U.S. and Iran that put the deal together the first time, and they want to do it again. But the one thing I would say is that the deal is fairly limited. It was oversold by Kerry and Obama. It's not a deal that makes the Americans friends of Iran. It's not a deal that will stop the Iranians from supporting terrorist organizations that attack the U.S. and our allies across the region. It's not a deal that will stop the Iranians from developing ballistic missiles in contravention to UN Security Council resolutions that prohibit them from doing so. And it's not a deal that will end all American sanctions against Iran or open diplomatic relations between the two countries. So in other words, yes, we can get back to the deal, and the Iranians will be prevented verifiably from developing nuclear weapons. They will be able to produce and export another 1 million barrels of oil. But that's about it. And it shouldn't be sold beyond that. We're not friends with this country.
Yeah, and just real quick, Ian, before we move on to the last subject here, I checked earlier yesterday the Times of Israel and Haaretz, and I haven't seen anything in the Israeli press. I mean, Anne-Marie mentioned, and we both talked about this earlier, that it's not getting a lot of play, but it doesn't seem to be even getting a lot of play in Israel, which sort of makes me wonder about these allegations.
Yeah, I mean, I suspect you'll start to see more play around it today because I've seen it start to pick up in the U.S. and social media. And again, a lot of conservatives that really oppose the JCPOA, the Iranian deal, are starting to talk about it. When they do that, the Israelis will as well. Again, the Israeli government does not want this deal to come back into force. So I would be really surprised if that continues, to be honest with you.
Got it.
So before we let you go, President Biden is set to address a joint session of Congress on the eve of his 100th day in office. What do you suppose his congressional audience is hoping to hear from him when it comes to foreign policy?
Look, there are some issues that the Congress actually does agree on. Most importantly, as we already discussed, is this effort to be harder line and more competitive with China. And I think that Biden's approach, which is not all about sticks and beating the Chinese up, because we do actually need to trade with them. We do want Chinese tourists in the United States. We want to buy goods from China. That's not going to change tomorrow. But the underinvestment inside the United States to make the Americans more competitive, to improve our educational system, to ensure that we have the ability to manufacture world-class semiconductors in the United States, I think that that's a place the Americans need to spend more money. I think there are a lot of people in Congress on both sides of the aisle that want to support that. Now, that doesn't mean that they're going to agree on how you pay for it. Doesn't mean they're going to agree on what kind of taxes they want to see. But but the general sense that in the United States, we have systematically underinvested in the kinds of broad infrastructure that make us competitive vis-a-vis China, the second largest economy in the world. That's a message that I think Biden needs to deliver. That's the foreign policy measure that ultimately matters the most. And if you want to be great at foreign policy, that begins at home.
All right. Ian Bremmer, always great to talk to you, my friend. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Be good, guys. See you.